Okay. First of all, thank you, Jasper. That was an interesting session, and it's obviously closely related to what I'll be talking about. There's definitely some overlap as well in the different things that we're both planned to say today. Ray, I can't actually seem to move the slides at all. Okay. So, as Ray said, I'm Joanne Woolmer, and I'm a researcher at Vision Critical. Welcome to my short case study-based session on social media sentiment, titled "Is It Real? Using Conventional Research to Validate and Quantify Social Media Finding." So the agenda, today I'll be starting off by taking a quick look at claimed social media usage. I'm hoping these figures will quantify what's actually happening as opposed to what we might think is happening. I'll be then moving on to the iPhone 5 study we carried out and telling you a bit about what we found online post-launch. So that's what we heard through listening to social media and then how we went about evaluating that buzz. The study has generated some conclusions and recommendations which I'll then run through. So a bit of background. According to Internet World Stats, there are an estimated 53 internet users in the UK. This is approximately 84% of the UK population. So we know that the majority of the UK are online. And putting this into context and taking Facebook users, we know that around 30 million people are Facebook users in the UK, which is around half the UK population. And from this, we know that 1% of Facebook users equates to approximately 300,000 people in the UK. In terms of usage, we asked our panel, which is a nationally representative panel of the online world, what social media they've used in the last week, and also from the same list of sites what they've used in the last year and also what they've used in the past week. So from left to right, we have the most used social media site down to the least used, and it's probably no surprise that Facebook tops the list over past year and past week frequencies. So we can assume that nearly 3/4 of the population have a Facebook account, with over 2/3 of these using their account in the last week. The drop-off can probably be accounted for by those who are infrequent users or those that are no longer interested in using their account. I find it quite common these days to hear people say they've lost interest in checking their Facebook. So 62% have used YouTube in the last year, but with a large drop-off showing that YouTube is probably is not used as frequently as Facebook. Just over half of those have used their account in the last week, which is probably a fairly typical usage pattern given the nature of the sites. So nearly 1/3 are using Twitter, so significant, but still doesn't have the same reach in the social media world as Facebook. And over 1/3 have not used their Twitter account in the last week. So the figures for LinkedIn highlight that many people probably set up an account and then only becomes of use to them, say in the last week. Well, those people that the drop-off for the last week usage probably accounts for those people who don't probably use as frequently and may only access their account when, say, looking for a new job. So moving on to the smaller players, sites like Instagram, Pinterest and Tumblr, which have much smaller past year instance and even smaller past week, meaning a tiny proportion are using these sites. So have these sites failed to take off, or is it a bit too early to spot any obvious trends? So as I mentioned, we looked at the case study of the iPhone 5. It's recent and relevant to social media given it's the launch of a smartphone. The image on this chart just accompanied the announcement of the announcement, which was identified as September the 12th this year. So we had it on our radar and we thought it would be an interesting opportunity to look and see what we could find out when listening to social media. So our approach, only a day after the iPhone 5 was launched did studies emerge around sentiment on social media. And of course this was expected given the media frenzy pre-launch. Post-launch, the media were always going to keep a close eye on emerging trends, given it often brings their story to life and makes an interesting read. So we kept an eye on the material that was available online to inform our study. We then used a social media monitoring tool to listen to the buzz after the launch and analysed our findings in a few different ways. But in order to answer our question, is it real, we followed up with a quantitative survey on our national access panel. We wanted to use this survey to validate and quantify what we had found. So Compositions Annie Pettit blogged on an article online which included this chart, which traced social media activity over time towards the launch. So this chart demonstrates the activity pre-launch and then on the day of September 12th, where we see that huge spike. However, this was a global picture and we wanted to see what the UK picture was like. So our first step was to ensure that we were looking at social media mentions from just the UK. Once we had done this, most of the mentions were from Twitter. Now, of course, there would have been many mentions on Facebook, but most social media monitoring tools can't legitimately track these due to the privacy protection on user accounts. An output we first looked at when taking UK tweets was this chart at the top of the slide, which mirrors almost exactly the same activity that was seen on that global chart on the slide previous to this one. So for either of these charts, together or alone, only scale the level of activity over time. It doesn't tell us what it means for that line to be this high, and it doesn't tell us or give us any insight into the nature of the tweets. And there's nothing at this stage to benchmark against. So even if we were to compare the level of activity to, say, the launch of the iPhone 4, you'd have to take into consideration patterns of social media usage do change over time, and therefore comparing them would potentially be inaccurate. What we can say, if we'd not known about the launch, that social media monitoring would have told us that something was happening, and that's a key strength of social media listening, so identifying that hive of activity, whether expected or not. So using a quantitative survey amongst our 2,000 people, which is a nationally representative sample, it tells us how many people were aware of the iPhone 5 launch. So we identified 81% of people were aware of the launch before September 12th. And this quantifiable number puts the whole process into some sort of context. Now we can say how many people knew about the launch and how many tweets there were in relation to it. So then we analyse sentiment. There are a few ways, as Jasper mentioned, about how to analyse sentiment, whether it's positive, neutral, or negative. So starting with automated, we ran the software on our Twitter mentions. Now at this point we'd extracted the Twitter mentions in the UK the day after the launch. So using the social media monitoring tool, we can see that it told us 6% were actually positive, 5% negative, and the majority, 85%, were neutral. So not quite happy with this, and also finding the outcome unconvincing, we decided to manually code a manageable amount of tweets. So to do this, we removed any PR or other media articles and also retweets, so leaving us with 444 tweets. After manually coding these, we can now see that 22% were positive, 21% negative, and just over half were neutral. So aside from the ratio of positive to negative, which remains quite similar, the overall story, once the data was cleaned up, was actually quite different. Although we added sentiment to the volume of activity happening, this data is still not rich enough to tell us what's driving those negative tweets and what's driving those positive ones. So to do that, we used our survey, and we wanted to see if our panellists were responding positively or negatively to these different aspects of the iPhone 5 that were mentioned in the launch. So in our survey, we'd actually asked all respondents whether they wanted an iPhone 5, and feedback tells us of the 2,000 samples surveyed that 31% did not want an iPhone 5 at all, and a net of 30% actually wanted one. So should we really be listening to the views of those who have no interest in the product at all, throwing up another question around whether all views are actually equal? When listening to social media, it is very hard to determine the characteristics of who we're listening to, what their agenda is, and their relationship with the brand. Because when we found that when looking at social media content, we could tell those that definitely wanted an iPhone 5, those who definitely didn't, but then there was a whole mass of people where it was impossible to tell their interest in the product. But given our survey was quantitative, we simply cut the data by those who wanted an iPhone 5 and looked at their response to the aspects mentioned, the different aspects of the iPhone 5 mentioned in the launch. So when we compare the results of those at a total level to those who want an iPhone 5, which we have the left-hand column, which are our total level results, and then we have our right-hand bar chart, which was around 30% of our sample, 30% who wanted an iPhone 5, which is around 600 people in our sample. So the results are shown in these following charts. The ratings of positive, negative and neutral change quite dramatically, and not surprisingly the picture is overall more positive. So we've sorted these by positive to negative of those who wanted an iPhone 5, and we can now see that over 2/3 respond quite positively, or respond positively to the 4G aspect announced in the launch, and now over half of those respond positively to the battery. So if I was Apple, these would be the types of answers I would be more interested in. So what the potential customers are thinking of the product, and their reaction to the launch is perhaps of more value. Moving on to one of the interesting themes that was emerging when analysing the content was that there was a number of references to O2, and those who aren't familiar, O2 is a UK network, telephone network, and we could see that 2 or 3 different messages were coming through with this, and we thought we'd check this out, see if it's real, and determine the size of any of these issues as well. So we went back to our server and we hosted another question on the panel asking what UK network people would prefer to use if they were to have the iPhone 5. The British networks include O2, Vodafone, Orange, T-Mobile and 3. So 32% said they preferred to have the iPhone 5 on the O2 network. And of those who said another network to O2, we then asked them an open question, why? So after manually coding a random sample of open-ended responses, we found that 9% went on to cite that there were 4G concerns. So by listening to social media, we were able to identify a topic which was one of the main spontaneous themes that was emerging. Then amongst these rejectors of O2 from our quantitative survey, so just under 10% claimed that it was those 4G concerns. Now we've ended up with a quantifiable piece of information that we could perhaps take to O2, who would be able to do something actionable with the information. Which leads me to conclude that social media listening is a must, although remembering that it's a blunt and uncalibrated tool. Identifying who it is you're listening to is important in terms of those individual characteristics which are often unknown, which leads me to recommend that social media listening should be used in conjunction with a quantitative survey should you wish to work out what's real and to determine how big the identified topics actually are. Thank you for listening. I'll hand it back over to you, Ray.